Hello, everyone. I hope you all had really amazing summers. We are so happy to welcome you back to the Brooklyn Rail's new social environment. Today is our 1080th episode. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the huge pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Anna Kunz, Chris Martin, Judy Pfaff, and Pepe Karmel. And I'll now introduce our guests and host for today's dialogue. Chicago-based artist Anna Kunz creates work grounded in a rigorous concern for generative process. Her expansive practice emanates from painting, leading to installation and collaboration. Working from a heterogeneous array of cultural traditions, Chris Martin makes paintings that serve as living documents of the eternal present. Martin lives and works in Brooklyn and in the Catskills, New York. Often cited as a pioneer of installation art and contributor to the pattern and decoration movement, Judy Pfaff creates work that spans disciplines and resists definition. Pfaff lives and works in Tivoli, New York. And our host today, Pepe Karmel, is a professor in the Department of Art History at NYU. He's the author of Picasso and the Invention of Cubism, Abstract Art, A Global History, and Looking at Picasso, and has written widely on modern and contemporary art. We are so thrilled to have you all back on the NSE today. So honored to have this conversation starting off our fall season. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Pepe, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and thank you for the introduction. And to everybody at the Rail, it's a pleasure to be back here with you on another NSE. These are such an important venue for the art world and talking about art. So I was going to say we have three great artists here today to discuss Al Held, but you've already done the intro. So let's just take a quick look at some of the work we're going to be talking about and then come back to things in more detail. So Eleanor, if you could pull up the first few images. Sorry, yeah. Next one after that, please. Right, so the occasion for this event is an exhibition at White Cube Bermondsey that was in London and just closed like 2 days ago. And I'm sorry, we should have asked them to hold it over, and we could have just, rented a plane and taken everyone, both the speakers and all the, listeners. We could have flown over to London to see it. But alas, not possible. So this just gives you a quick overview of the show. I'll be in a minute or two going back to look at this in more detail. But I thought it was also important to provide some visuals for the people who will be speaking today. So Eleanor, if we could go to the next image, please. This is a recent work by Judy Pfaff, picking up the pieces to a detail shot. It was a big, complicated installation, but spectacular in the tradition of your work since the 80s, really. And then the next one, please. And a recent, or not that recent, actually, 2013. How did that get to be more than 10 years ago? A big installation in Rotterdam with paintings of greatly varied sizes. So I want to circle back to this later, Chris, and talk about your goals in this installation, but, just quick hit here. And if we could go to the next one, please. So this is a recent installation by Anna Kunz, color cast with canvases that are both hanging in space on the walls, even on the floors, it appears. So again, extending into three dimensions. So that said, I'm very eager to get into conversation with the three of you, but let me begin instead with a quick review of some of Al Held's work so that we all, refresh our memory of his evolution as an artist. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So recently, there's been a fair amount of attention to his early work done in Paris, and then when he returned to New York. And one of the things that's really striking is his evolution from a kind of familiar New York school gestural all overness, as you see in the picture on the left, and then this begins to take on more definite form until by the end of the 1950s, you see definite shapes like those mustard-colored rectangles appearing at the bottom here, and then those bars of kind of scumbled white and green towards the top of the canvas. So you feel an evolution towards shape, and if we could go to the next image, then there's this wonderful breakthrough in his work in 1959 when he makes a series of paintings, the Taxi Cab series, that were displayed, I want to say 20 years, but I'm afraid it may be more like 30 years ago at Robert Miller. There was a big show of these paintings, a whole bunch of them, and it was just overwhelmingly great. These were somewhere a kind of loose, free-flowing, very energetic kind of abstraction that seemed very different from anything that I'd ever seen before. And then if we go to the next image, please. Then by the mid-60s, and obviously I'm skipping over, a series of very important works, he begins making paintings like this one, Mao, which is in the collection of the Modern, which is striking for being symmetrical, a circle within a circle. And these are familiar qualities of work, since Jasper Johns' Targets. But here there's a particular attention to overlapping. So the white overlaps the mustard, that overlaps the blue square, and then there are little bits of black triangles that indicate that there's a black square somewhere behind them. Then if you look at the top and bottom edges, there's black and yellow. There seems to be more layers. It feels like you could keep drilling down into this picture and you keep discovering more. Okay, if we could go to the next. But at the same time that he reaches that kind of summit of a very personal kind of abstraction, this is what made him a famous artist, he then launches into something completely different, which are these turning and twisting shapes that seem like, wild ductwork, metal boxes or something turning in space, that he tests out in an early painting like this one, black, white, and green, which is actually quite large. And then if we go ahead again, please, Eleanor. Then he does a whole series of these dramatic pictures that are in black lines on white, like this one, Aesopus 1 from 1969, which make the sense of open, potentially infinite space even stronger. And then if we could go to the next, he then experiments with reversing the relationship of black and white. So in this really remarkable picture, the lines are of different thicknesses and weights. So they're very narrow ones that are just barely visible, other ones that are broader and very strong visually, so that this drama of different widths and weights coexists with the drama of the illusionistic three-dimensional forms. Now, needless to say that this whole kind of thing was total anathema to, quote unquote, Greenbergian formalism. So this was, revolutionary work to be making in the late 60s and the 70s. And then let's go to the next, please. By the 80s, he's gone off into this extraordinary realm of what I always used to think of as science fiction paintings, these infinite spaces with forms twisting and turning through endless space. And you can see how big these canvases are. And Chris, you had mentioned something last week about scale, and I want to come back to that point later about the role of scale, internal scale in these pictures, not just their literal size, but their literal size is really big. And if we could go to the next one, here's a detail from that. As you can see, he's also working with a very unusual set of colors where there are contrasting colors like green and orange, but they're also tinted. Some of them are tinted and made paler. Some of them are shaded with black to make them darker. So he's engaging with the kind of Renaissance tradition of color, not just the illusionistic space, but also, particular traditional kinds of color in a way that you don't expect at all in abstract painting. So this seems to be, really extraordinary work that I think was incredibly exciting and also very difficult for people to accept in this time. Okay, let's go to some questions here. Maybe we could turn off the image. Let's hold this one for later, please. So I want to start with a question to Judy and Chris. Both of you studied with Held at Yale. It was at different points in your own careers. Judy, you were a graduate student. Chris, I think you were an undergraduate at that time. What was he like as a teacher, and what did his work mean to you at that time?
Chris, do you want to go first, or?
Well, I think uh, Judy, you were very, very close to Al and really had a lifelong dialogue with him that I didn't. I didn't really get to know him until the last sort of 10 years of his life. But as an undergraduate, I saw the show at the Whitney, and he was teaching, and he was such a powerful personality. So he actually kind of, the encounter with Al got me to drop out of college. Because I went, well, this school is ridiculous. Everything's happening in New York City. So I owe Al for helping me leave college.
Well, for me, I was really close to Al. We met in 1971, and the year he died, the day he died, I actually was flying to Cody to, meet with him there. That was 40 some years of arguing. The first thing he ever said to me, and I've repeated this many times, is like, so you're the new dumb blonde. And I think I said, and you're the janitor? So we really got on very well. Now we got a big, and he was an extraordinary teacher, if you could take it. He was tough, straightforward, brilliant. I think so brilliant. And he loved the discourse, and even an irritable discourse. He was fine with that. What I thought was interesting for me, because I'd gotten away with just being sort of, in quotes, talented, which he could care less about. He wanted to know what I thought. He wanted to know what the paintings meant. And I was never asked those questions. So he would come back every week, and I sort of would try to answer the last week's questions. And a lot of people they didn't have difficulty with him. They could either like him or lump him. I thought he was an extraordinary energy and force and intellect, and sort of demanded that of the students too. And Chris, I know that and I saw that David Rowe was in the group. And were you two together at the same time?
Yes, David. Hi, David. He was my teacher. He was in the graduate school, and he was my TA in my painting class. So,
Chris, what year? 74?
This is 74, maybe? Yeah, 74. Yes. I mean, the one thing I was aware of was that all the other teachers at school came across as teachers, and Al came across as a real artist. And so when he talked to you, it was like, I'm Al Held, I'm a great painter. Who are you? And so there wasn't this, I'm the professor. It was like, I'm Al, and what do you got to say for yourself? And so I found that just electrifying and very challenging and wonderful.
Let me follow this up by asking you not just what was he like as a human being and a teacher, but also what his paintings seemed like to you at that time. I mean, I think by now they're recognized as, modern or contemporary masterpieces, but my own recollection, probably more from the 80s than the 70s, is that they were controversial, that, a lot of people found them hard to accept given the canonical ideology of the era. But, here were the two of you as young artists. What did this work look like to you? What did you see in his painting at that time in the 70s?
Well, for me, I knew about the conversation about flatness and Al's kind of crazy obsession with space. And that interested me. As a student, I thought they were beautiful, but also I think there's something that you can miss when you look at the slides. They look so perfect. They look like, they were just digitized and sort of seamlessly. Each one of them were thick and weird in the beginning, and then they were sanded down and put back perfectly. So I think when you see them, they're so graphic and so clean, but they didn't arrive easily that way. It was a funny process. But he was such a he loved to talk about space. So I found him supremely interesting. And Chris, you're right. He was an artist, and he wanted you to be one too. And you couldn't sort of get away with not paying attention to what was going on in the world, in the city. What did you see? What do you think of this? So he was dogged in asking about things. And I thought his paintings and the scale of them, I've always done big paintings or big things. So I found comfort in that and incredibly interested. And so, the conversation about what was going on in the art world, the kind of conceptual and minimal, he was completely uninterested in that, which I found interesting.
Maybe this is a good point, Anna, for me to turn to you. I mean, you weren't a student of Held's, but it seems like there's a powerful affinity between your work and his. And could you say something about what it means to you, what you see in it?
Sure. But before that, if you don't mind, I really need to take this second to ask Chris and Judy if they have any memorable sound bites that Al Held told them during critique or visit, that they sort of kept, that you recall, that sort of special things that he might have pointed you in a direction or said something that you remember?
Well, my fondest, most powerful memory is actually much later. I was visiting him probably around 2008 or 9. And in his studio in Boyceville, and he had a gigantic painting there. And I had just come back from Arizona, and I was telling him that it looked like looked like this giant landscape. And Al just erupted. He went, "Don't give me that landscape thing," And at that point, I realized the way to have a conversation with Al was going to be a great argument. And so we had a great argument. And so it was the first time that I met his anger and his "don't give me that bullshit" with "come on, Al." And I felt for the first time, that I could have a good argument with this man without being so intimidated.
Wow.
Also, stuff with the landscape. I mean, I was always saying like, oh, so you go to Rome and Florence and you become like Italian, and all of it's like Italian landscape, and you've got light and kind of deep, Renaissance space. And it took him a long time to accept that, because he wanted to be an abstract artist. That was sort of this thing he had in his head, and he would say like, "Judy, what do you think of this? Is this like, getting to be like real, not realism, but like a still life or a thing?" And I said, "Well, yeah, you're getting kind of close to that, Al, but that he hated. Also, he hated I always thought they were psychological. I was talking to Mara in Hudson yesterday or the day before. And I said, when he was having problems with Sylvia, his wife, all of the paintings became these kind of cages. And I thought, holy crap, that's what you're going through. And then when he went to Italy, they were all these like endlessly beautiful landscapes and stuff. So I think they were much more responsive to landscape than he would ever have admitted, And Anna, to I think the thing that I remember him saying to me, I mean, there are a million things, but one of them was, I think I would sometimes get defensive and say, well, you know, that's not who I am, or that's not what I think. And he said, I don't really care.
Ooh.
I want to know who you're going to become or what you're going to think. Like, he really hated that kind of defense of like, you know, this is who I am. He said, I don't care who you are. I want to know who you're going to be. And that has actually always stuck with me, not to be so, solid in your perception of yourself. He thought everyone could expand. And if you look at the trajectory of his career, that's exactly the way he was.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I do have the opportunity to discover Al Held and be able to see, you know, the breadth of every phase of his work. And Pepe, to your question, you know, I've always been really interested in artists who are somehow self-made and also in the pursuit of bringing art into the social arena. And I think of that as one of the great things art can do, is to bring people together. And it seems to me that Al Held spent an enormous amount of time. There's just so much time and care embedded in every single phase of his work, that to discover that as a young artist, and now I'm not a young artist, he was sort of one of my VIPs for a very long time. And I also really appreciate in knowing his autobiography through his paintings, you know. So those are some of the key reasons why Al Held has been an artist I think about. And I have to admit, I'm kind of more interested in those thoughts than I am in the way his paintings actually look. I'm really more profoundly moved by the physical dedication that he put into his work from those 50s paintings, which were completely knockout. When I saw those, that was just knockout, to the work at the end of his life with Roberta's Trip. I find them all to be everything I said, plus poetic in many ways as well. So to me, he's been a good touchstone for me that I've thought about. But thanks for the question.
Of course, thank you. And I want to come back and, you know, try to get you to say more about your own sense of relationship to his work later on. What I'd like to do now is to kind of focus in on the work of each of the three of you for a few minutes and think about possible connections to Held. So Eleanor, if we could go back to that detail from Roberta's Trip, which I think was the last thing we looked at. Okay, so here's where we were in 1986 with these forms turning long, enormous, seemingly enormous forms turning and twisting through space. And then if we could go to the next one. Judy, you were kind enough to send me images of a bunch of your recent installations. And I was struck in this particular one, Smoke Fisker, which I'm probably mispronouncing, from 2023. By these long curving cylinders. I don't know if they're modeled from something or what, but that are moving through the whole, across the whole space of the gallery in a very dramatic way. And they remind me of those long pieces of this terrible word, the ductwork in Held's paintings. Was this possibly something that you were thinking of, or that was at the back of your head, that, you know, that kind of composition as an inspiration? So that was one question I had about this installation. Sorry, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
You're back. Yes, thank you.
No, was my answer. He's been in my head for so long that occasionally I'll do something, I'll think, Al will hate that. But the, I always got for him these layers. And I don't know if you can see this, but there are like things on the ceiling, things in the middle, things on the ground, things under, the light underneath. So there was always complication and sort of noise, a lot of noise and a lot of things happening in the space. So, but no, I had forgotten about those pieces, but he's always in my head, always. Yeah.
Well, the noisiness, actually, that's a great word for it, seems, if anything, kind of contrary to his work, which, however complicated it gets, is, clean and precise, and you know where everything is.
Well, he worked it, I think that's why he liked aspects of what I did. He also hated aspects of what I did. It was physical, and it evolved over time, and the layers added, and because it's sculpture and not painting, you can sort of see the layers and know how they're kind of put together. But he loved that I took on things in this big way, and obviously in that way, he would come to the studio. I had a studio in Kingston that was in a tugboat factory. So it was really, really big and really kind of crazy. And I filled the whole thing up. And he said, I don't really like this, but at least you filled it up. And that was our whole thing, like give and take and teased each other. Yeah.
Let me come back with a question about Smoke Fisker in itself, not in relation to Held. Obviously, the seeing in the photograph is no substitute for being there. But one thing that struck me is the contrast between those long cylindrical forms, which feel relatively abstract, though maybe they're somehow related to tree trunks and branches. But beneath them, there's a bunch of things that are very organic, that seem like plant-like leafy forms. And I was wondering, how do you come to combining these structurally different elements?
Well, Smokefisker means squid in Icelandic. And I don't know if I'm saying it correctly either, but I just come back from Iceland, which I think everybody has either been there or should go there. But there are these things about that landscape which are very surprising. And, so I was really trying to, and a lot of my work actually, Holly Solomon used to say, be careful where you take her, because I'm going to have to look at that imagery for years. So this was really in relationship to the landscape, the water, the crusty stuff, the lichen, the things that happen in the earth, which I had actually never quite seen that way before I went there.
Great, thank you. Eleanor, if we could go to the next slide, please. This is your current installation, which opened like 3 days ago at Wave Hill. Congratulations.
Yeah, but this is one room of 3 rooms. So the piece is actually 3 rooms. This is 1 room. And this is at Wave Hill in the Bronx. And it really echoes this place that I lived in Kingston, which was a Second Empire Victorian house that I had to leave. So I just kind of made it like nostalgic, this kind of icy, it's almost like Dr. Zhivago or something, this icy cold memory of my house. And then the room next to it is almost like, anyway, there are 3 rooms. So I see the 3 rooms as one piece. So this is, in fact, a detail. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I can't wait to get up there to see the whole thing. Let's, picking up on what you just said about Holly Solomon, if Eleanor, we could go to the next image, please. Here's a detail from your installation Deepwater that was at Holly Solomon in 1980. And I can't remember if I saw this firsthand or not. It's something I've often shown in classes, so I feel like I did, but maybe not. But I just wanted to remind people of Holly Solomon's, role in the art world as, the gallerist who really almost put pattern and decoration on the map, and other people that she represented included Robert Kushner here on the right, although I couldn't find a contemporary work from him by 1980 that related to this. At the time, pattern and decoration, that which you were associated with simply by dint of being at Holly Solomon, seemed just shockingly hedonistic. And, the people, I think, were offended that it wasn't, grim and serious like minimalism or something. In hindsight, how do you see your relationship to the P&D as a movement?
I resisted that connection. Holly was one of the extraordinary dealers. She loved mischief. She loved color. She was the only dealer I've ever had. Is when I was finished with this piece, which was actually quite big, it's like 80 feet across. She'd say, "What about doing the basement? What about doing the bathroom?" She just loved stuff. This, Bob Kushner, Kim McConnell, I'm forgetting a lot of people. She could put them in a suitcase and take the show to Paris. So mine was always very hard, not only to sell, but to navigate and to ship but by the way, I'm so glad you recognize she was very, very important. P&D was one of the most despised movements in the art world ever. And just the last couple of years, it's been re-looked at and seen as a kind of it's kind of topical now, joyous kind of movement. And, Bob Kushner is like a Buddhist and, has drawn flowers his whole life and just loves to look at flowers. And he used to be kind of outrageous with the costumes and stuff. But Holly loved all this stuff. She was extravagant and generous and a little kooky, crazy. And just the more you could do, the better she liked it. So, I think it's only the last, and she was edited out of art history, still a bit. I'm surprised that she's not revered more.
Great, thank you. Fritz, let me turn to your work at this point, because there's a nice transition here. When we were talking last week, you mentioned that you had seen Deepwater back in 1980, and you were really blown away by it. And let's see, Eleanor, yes, thank you. Good. Could you say more about your experience in 1980? What you see as the relationship between your work and Judy's and so forth?
Well, this show was an extraordinary show. There's no photographs that can really do it justice. I had never experienced anything like it, and I think there were many young artists, friends of mine, and many people that were just shocked and overjoyed at this show. And it was like walking into a giant painting, and it had an endless amount of detail that one can get lost in, and then there were these large color moments. So it really was a masterpiece, and it really affected me. I think at that time, I was still wrestling with a more minimal approach in my paintings. My drawings were freer, but it took me a long time to really internalize and understand that kind of freedom and audacity that Judy showed in that show. It was just a masterpiece of a show. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
This is a line from 2005.
Yes.
You can't see, but there are large areas in the painting that are, 6 inches stick out into there are these collaged forms sticking out in the middle of the painting.
Yes. Oh, I didn't realize that. That sounds remarkable. Let's go, Eleanor, let's go to the next slide, please. And so here, let's come back to Al Held. And, I've been trying to think about possible connections, specific, boring art historical. On the left, notice this, on the right, notice that kind of connections. So I was thinking about this painting of yours, Chris, from 1995, which seems, it has an extraordinary play with space. I mean, to begin with, the surround, the borders look like a proscenium stage or something, like, the stage curtain has come up and we see this open stage and a set. And then there are these two shapes, overlapping shapes in the middle that are some kind of classic gestalt or something, illusion, squares within squares, which at one moment seem to be receding into space, like you're looking into a box. And then at the next moment, they seem to be advancing towards you with a small front end and a bigger back end, like a chopped off pyramid. But also there's one on top of another, which means that it doesn't seem like the one in front could possibly be receding because there isn't room. So there's all kinds of amazing visual paradoxes here. And that, I was wondering, to what extent could that be associated with the kind of spatial play that we're seeing in a work like Held's Asopus on the left here?
Well, I think you can see Al in this, the illusion of the kind of frame. I had come back from Mexico and was deeply moved by a bunch of tableau paintings that I had seen. And I think that stage-like thing was somehow came from that. But probably the most important thing, one of the most important things I got from Al was that sense that he painted and repainted and repainted. And he arrived at a kind of tension in his paintings by adjusting them, an inch here, an inch there. And to go back, in the 70s when I hit New York, there was so much kind of conceptual art going on. And a lot of the big abstract painters were basically graphing something out and then painting it in. So Stella is not painting and repainting, and there's no sense of that in his paintings. He has an idea, he draws it out, he executes it. And Al was the opposite. So the paintings are a result of this process. I think Pepe, you wrote a lovely article about Pollock dealing with Picasso, and you talked about sum of destructions. And so I think that's something that I have never lost in terms of my continuing to learn from Al, was how far you could work and rework and discover something in the physical act of changing things. And in this painting, when you get up close to these paintings, it's a 12-foot tall painting, you see all these lines that are painted over and over and changed. So it was a time in my life that was very difficult for me, and I reduced my work to black and white and acrylic, and I was able to come in, the acrylic dries very fast, and I could paint something out and a focused ability to work.
All right, Chris, can you repeat what you just said? That we lost a few seconds there, or at least I did.
I don't know if they were important seconds.
I'm sure they were.
But one thing I can also say is that Judy was very articulate about how Al was obsessed with the abstract. It was like a holy grail for that generation to be abstract, how important that was. And for me, as a quote unquote abstract artist, I was really actually obsessed with emotional healing and emotional connection to the forms in the painting. I was working at that point for many years as a therapist working with people with AIDS. And so I was surrounded by, in my job, with people dying all the time. And so these black and white paintings, this was a way for me to process grief. And I was aware of that and thought about it and talked about it, which Al would have never wanted to hear.
Well, that's very moving. I have another, comparison I want to ask you about, but before we move on, I wanted to go back to what you said a minute ago about the traces of the changes remaining visible, that the paintings were, his and yours, weren't just blown up from diagrams or sketches and then precisely reproduced at larger scale, but that the reworking is visible in the finished canvas. Because you see that in Mondrian going back to very, very early in his work, and they all look so neat and clean in photographs, but when you're in a museum and you're standing in front of one of them, you can see how a vertical line has been moved half an inch to the right, and there's a channel where it was before, or something like that. That the surface of the painting is very uneven as a result of the working, and it gives you a sense of the precision and delicacy of his thinking about proportion and so forth. It would be interesting to do a kind of history of modern art in terms of that process of reworking, who did it, who didn't. But let's go to the next pair. So I already talked a bit about Mao and the role of the subtle overlappings here. And when you sent me this image, High Noon, Chris, I thought about the top edge and so forth, where there seems to be a similar kind of overlapping going on. So I wondered if you could say something about that. As usual, my question is, were you thinking of Al Held when you did this?
I think Al, is somebody I'll always be in dialogue with and arguing with. I first saw this painting, Mao, at the Whitney on mescaline with my friend Peter Atchison. And I remember thinking that the white form actually came off the canvas about 3 or 4 feet. And I was afraid to bump into the painting. It's a great, great painting. And you have to experience this painting in person to get that really powerful sense of the form. That's not a circle. That white form is this bulbous thing that it's a great, great painting. And this painting of mine went through a lot of changes. While I was painting it, my old friend Frank Moore died, and it became kind of a memorial to Frank. I had just come back from India, and Mani Karnika Ghat in Varanasi is a place where there are open cremations going on at the Ganges River, and it's a very powerful experience. And so somehow Frank, and then this sense of watching the burning pyres in the middle of the day. But for me, that little thing at the top of the painting is a sun. And Al would have been mortified if someone saw something in one of his paintings and said, "Oh, I see, there's the sun and the moon." No, no. And for me, it was really important. It's an abstract painting, but it's also the architecture that I remembered from Mani Karnika Ghat. And it's also the noonday sun. So.
Speaking of the architecture, looking at some of the interviews you've given over the years, I've noticed that you describe a certain recurrent form in your work as a griffin. And I was wondering if these red lines, which divide as they move downwards, were a griffin. What is that motif about? What does it signify to you, and so forth?
Well, ultimately, I have no idea, but for many, many years, I was compelled to deal with these 4 legs and 3 doors. And in this case, it goes from 4 to 7 to 11. But I don't know why I do that.
Well, okay. So there's 2 questions. One is, why do the forms these way? But the other one is, why have you referred to it as a griffin? I mean, I was searching around for something. Is it like, the claws of a griffin, or is that just hopelessly?
There are others where the top of the red form has a head, and they even had a jagged 2 wings coming out. This one does not. You cannot see that form here, but others you can see that it's a kind of a 4-legged creature, very much influenced by the Persian, those gates with that giant four-legged beast. So they came
Yeah.
out of a dream that I had had. And it was ridiculous. I kept saying, this is a griffin and it's an abstract painting, but this is not a griffin.
Okay.
This one is.
Good to know. So I had intended to ask you about that big installation, but we're running a little short on time. So Eleanor, if we could click forward 2 slides, the next one, please. I'm sorry to let this one go by. And Anna, I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about this installation and your other work that you sent me. This looks so extraordinary with these canvases hanging in space and placed all over. And you had told me something about your thoughts about this last week. And of course, as usual, my monomaniacal way, I want to say, well, how is this related to space and held? But let me just hand you the microphone on this one.
Oh, I hope I don't drop it. This installation, which happened at the Hyde Park Art Center in Chicago, where I'm from, was my way of creating my own retrospective. After about 10 years of working, I was given the opportunity to do something in this community center, sort of Midwest Kunsthal public space. They do wonderful exhibitions, really important things for the community there as well. So my first consideration was to figure out a way to use this architectural container and do something of a hybrid between painting and public work. And also because I was thinking about this idea of the retrospective, how could I present my work in different forms and assign different new material identities to past work. So I'm interested in this generative thing, so I'm always trying to find new ways to present and contextualize things that I do, even if they're conventional paintings. Ultimately, they serve a bigger purpose of an installation in architecture, etc. So in this particular work, I have some painted fabric, and I do this process, which I consider a transference process, where the plain fabric is pinned to the architecture, and then I sort of penetrate the paint through the fabric to register to the wall, and then I pull it away. So in essence, it's sort of a giant monotype. A lot of my background is in printmaking and in performance. Formally, I never studied painting, except I went to Northwestern to study art theory and practice later. So I'm using all the things I have, all my resources, and to create this work where I had bodies in mind mostly. So on the floor of the piece is, you can't hear it, but it's wired with transducers that vibrate, a cello composition that my friend Beth Bradfish created for me. So that runs and the floor vibrates. Depending on where you're standing, you could feel that. And there's an ADA access ramp that you see this person standing on. And that was because I was trying to be as holistic as possible with my viewers and my participants. So making sure everyone could get in and move around the space. And yes, bodies in mind. And as far as like the held connection, I didn't think of this directly at the time, but here with our conversation, I'm thinking a lot about, I always think about Renaissance painting. I think about placement. Renaissance painting is about placement a lot. This idea that the painting is, in essence, an invitation into a space. And a lot of times when I talk about this work, I call them volumetric paintings. They originate in 2 dimensions and then come into play in the architecture when I'm in the space. And even though it looks very, everything is full of intention here, because I've spent a lot of time, there's a lot of math here and I had help. But I also leave a lot of room for improvisation within the structure. And I think that what Chris and Judy were talking about in terms of the not always apparent improvisational and room for chance aspects of Held's work, I see a relationship with that as well.
Great, thank you. Eleanor, if we could go to the next, thank you. Anna, when we were talking last week, you emphasized something about Held's distinctive use of color. And I think, that's obviously visible, but it's a little hard to define. So I was wondering, could you say more about what you mean about that distinctive color in Held's work, but also can you relate it to your own very particular use of color in your work?
Yes. So with the pigment paintings held on the left, I remember reading something that he talked about, also threading through our previous conversation here, about the paintings were not constructed, they were both built and felt. And in the left painting on the left, those pigment paintings were very heavy, an accumulation of marks. The facture of them was also the structure. I think that he also didn't really use painter's tools like brushes, and I don't either when I make my work, and I'm layering them very slowly in space, in physical space. I'm painting them on the floor in a much more performative way. I'm not really decided upon the final sort of formal resolution until the very end. And I see a similarity there with Al Held's painting, where it looks like those triangular forms that are the sort of ochre color are sitting on top of the more built out background. Also, the rhythm of the work and the repetition and mirroring, those are all things I just love to work with as well when I'm constructing the work. So there's this formal sort of sobering up at the very end. And I see a similarity with Al Held's pigment painting. Do you know the size, Pepe, of the Held painting we're seeing right now?
I don't. My recollection is, or my impression is, that the paintings of this series are sort of medium, small format, that he got really big with the Taxicab series, but maybe Chris or Judy would have a more accurate reading on that.
Some of those pigment paintings were huge.
Oh.
And I also feel it's really interesting for me to think about the relationship he had with the dancer Yvonne Rainer. And Yvonne Rainer's, approach to her dances was very much about taking pedestrian movement, or non-high, not finessed movement. I see that in Held's here. I also think that she thought a lot of times as her body or muscle, her muscular system being a medium for her work. And I think that Held was also probably pretty informed by, they probably sat around and had talks about the importance of the pedestrian movement, the bodily movement, how those things could, point towards building out into the social sphere and being inclusive. So those things are all things that float around in my head when I'm painting, what I'm trying to think about, and it sustains me in the studio when I'm painting. And then finally, I guess the centrality of the light. There's always sort of a central light or a light source in Held's work, and even in this painting on the left, you can see that high contrast happening. So it sort of feels to me like light is emitting from the painting, and I also love to make my paintings emit light when I can. And it's all done through the relationships of color. It's flat, but it's possible. And plenty of artists have worked with color that way. But I also feel like that optical experience that color can give can make you feel included into the work. And it sort of collapses distance between the viewer and the painting in a beautiful way. And I don't think I'll probably ever get tired of thinking about that.
Great. One last question, really, just about your work. You mentioned a moment ago that you don't work with conventional brushes, and that feeds into something I wanted to know anyway, which is, in this painting on the right, for instance, like in the sort of turquoise and lavender areas, the what seem to be monochromes, there's an intense texture. There's actually lighter and darker patches that have a just very distinctive rhythm. So how do you arrive at that?
I'm painting on top of them. I have a plank that I traverse, so I paint my paintings simultaneously on the floor, so I can be very active and sort of dance-like when I'm making the work. And the color is sort of a call and response situation where I work really pretty slowly with color. I usually work one color a day on the paintings, and I assign the color that I'm working with that day a specific role, be it formal for space, or sometimes it's more a voice. So the monochrome situation, those are all because they're layered in different times, different days and different times. So the ending result is, it's sort of like weaving in a way.
Yes, that's terrific. Thank you. So I know we should go to Q&A in a very few minutes, but before we do that, I just wanted, Eleanor, we can take the images down, I think. I just wanted to ask, are there other things about held, questions, Anna or Judy or Chris, that you want to raise, things we haven't gotten to in this discussion? Oh, Judy, you're muted.
All right. I wanted to add to what Chris said about Mao. I saw that painting in his studio, and since he always talked about space, I realized, and he said this out loud, those paintings, he wanted to do exactly what Chris felt, like that white, and everything was like coming, instead of receding in that kind of traditional painting space, he wanted it to like physically almost assault you and come out at you. And also I wanted to say about like the reason he used to sand these paintings down, which is really one of the craziest processes I've ever thought about, is because Barbara Rose wrote something about Al always being an expressionist. And he hated that because he found these things so mental and so provocative mind images that because the way he painted, they built up all this kind of like elephant skin. The sanding down was to like erase any dialogue ever talking about him being an expressionist again. So I think that was just crazy, interesting, and no one will ever realize that Al couldn't even turn on a computer. So these are not fabricated digital, is true, right, Chris? I mean, he was
Right.
like, anyway, I wanted to get that clear. If you ever see them and they look like these most refined, he knew what he was doing. It spun out seamlessly, elegantly. No, he was dogged and made these things work and made people, he would sit back in his kind of armchair, look at the things and sort of figure them out and have them redo this painting all the time. So it's the reality of these paintings is so different than what you think you see, or you think they are. So anyway.
And I would just want to say that for all the museum directors watching and curators, it's long overdue that we have a big Al Held show in New York City. And he's a great, great artist. And many others of his generation have received incredible examinations in New York museums. And we need a great big Al Held show in New York City.
Amen. So, Eleanor, I think we're at the point where we go to Q&A, or am I jumping the gun on that?
Yeah, we can turn to Q&A. We've got a few great questions here from the audience. And yeah, first, just huge thank you so much to Judy and Pepe and Anna and Chris for this really, really brilliant dialogue. It's been such a joy. Our first question today from the audience will be from our friend GE. GE, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Chloe, and thank you all for this discussion. Thank you always to the rail. Because it held great scale over time and in composition, it seemed as though he believed that virtuosity and continuity were key to some kind of his being essential that way, especially in the way he projected these landscapes that seemed sometimes internal. Is there anything to this?
Could you say a bit more about that? I feel like you're raising a really important question, but I didn't fully understand what you said.
Right. It just seemed as though his approach to being substantial and making something substantial and great, epic even, whatever, on those scale, it seemed as though, the key to that kind of virtuosity and also that continuity over time and, the scale of time and the composition, it seemed to be, the way he seemed to be projecting these internal landscapes out into our world for us.
Yeah. I think he wanted to blow you away. I think he wanted to be blown away. And when they're big like that, you kind of can't escape them, and you really have to confront them. You can't just sort of like have a cup of tea and walk by it, or a glass of wine, or a joint and pass by. They were really in your way. You had to absorb them, and the scale was really helpful for that.
The word project in combination with what you were saying, Chris, a few moments ago, makes me think about that. If Mao projects forward, I mean, that's an old goal in modernism, starting essentially with Georges Braque, who, talking about his first Cubist paintings of 1908 and so on, said that he wanted to get rid of perspective, that he didn't want the painting to go back, he wanted the painting to come forward toward the viewer. And so you could draw a line from Braque in 1908 to Held in 1967, and yet the later more illusionistic paintings, my reaction to seeing them is that they pull me into a deep space. I don't feel them as projecting in front of the canvas in the same way, but maybe that's a misreading. What do you think?
I feel like they're calling, first of all, they're more entertaining on scale. And I would be willing to bet they're almost movie screen scale. The minute you sit in front of a movie, even if you're in the dark, you immediately say, entertain me. So there's that. They're macho, but they feel immersive. They feel like more like they're still sticking to the exploration of some progressive social values that he had in mind. I know that he at one point even wanted to be a social worker. I just feel like there's so much to the paintings that are in every form. They're always trying to collapse the distance between the viewer and the work. And I mean, virtuosity can be big, it can also be really super small, so I do think Chris is right about the show. And the one thing I also wanted to point out is that in a lot of those big paintings, Pepe, like, Roberta's Trip, none of the colors, there are many, many shapes, but none of the colors really repeat themselves very much. There are some really, really subtle variations in the color. So each color sort of holds its own space. And I think that's really part of the virtuosity of them.
Well, that's a big shift away from classical modernism also. I mean, starting with Cézanne, even going back behind Braque and Picasso, you get this idea of, well, you should pick the 6 colors you're going to use, and whatever you're looking at in the real world, you're going to translate it into that choice of 6 colors. So the variety of colors in Held is itself, shocking and brilliant.
Yes, and that's another way he's exploring relationships.
Eleanor, do we have another question?
We do. Thank you so much, GE. Thank you, everyone, for those responses. I will ask the next question on behalf of an audience member. The panelists know Held so well. What is it that they are curious about and want to know more about? What are the questions that the panel has about Held's work?
Well, I'm still curious about the discussions he had with other artists and how they reciprocated ideas. You know, I'm really interested in the short relationship he had with Yvonne Rainer, and I'm wondering how those conversations went and how maybe her ideas of the pedestrian and the specificity of placement influenced or informed his work, and vice versa. That's one thing I'm interested in. But you guys.
I feel that I really miss Al right now having this conversation, because I think it would be wonderful to be able to just have a long conversation, a big argument with him again. So there are a lot of things I would love to talk to him about.
I think I would like to see where the paintings went now. It's almost been 10
Yeah.
place he was in. Where the fuck would it be now? You know, like, where would he be going now? Because I do think he entered a much more psychological realm, and also his mom and dad died. And I remember him saying, I'm an orphan now. And then he started making these very strange and moody landscape paintings from that. And so in a strange way, I don't think he ever admitted it. I think what was happening in his life really did influence those paintings. And I would be so curious to see where, because, and Chris, you're right. Arguing with Al was so fun, you know, and also a Republican-ish. I think he just said he was just because it made me crazy. So yeah, where would he be? What would he be doing now?
As an art historian, I always want to know where people start from. So I would love to know, how on earth did that transition of 1967 happen? How do you go from the one kind of picture to the other? It's like this, you know, crazy, brilliant leap. Maybe there's some evidence somewhere that helps explain it.
I always think of those black and white paintings. They're so complicated and beautiful. Probably some of the only Al Held paintings I've been really able to see in person, beyond the pigment paintings and the one that's in the collection of the Art Institute. But because they remind me so much of coloring books, I feel within them there's also this invitation for us to sort of color them with our own imagination. So they seem very colorful, even though they don't have any color.
It's striking that early one, I don't know if it's the first, but has black and white against this green ground, which is very not smooth, not uniform, mottled kind of. And then that goes away. The color goes away for a while and then comes back in a very different form. Not sure what to make of that.
No.
Eleanor.
Did you want to add a question, Chris?
Add a question? I can't think of anything.
Wonderful.
No, good.
Do we have more from the Q&A?
We do. We've got two more. The next question will be from Nicola. I wonder if the panel could talk about the possible influence of computer graphics. The space in Held's later paintings seem to me to prefigure the aesthetics of films like Tron and video games like Minecraft.
I don't think he knew anything about that stuff. I really don't. He didn't know how to work a computer, and he would have help doing that kind of thing. But I think he would like it. I don't know. I think he would like it, you know, that relationship. But I think he would also be pissed off that it's sort of got, that the human and the hand was sort of erased. And he wanted the ideas to stay, but he also needed the body and the hand and the mind in equal things. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yes, I remember going. PS1 had one gigantic Al Held painting up. I don't know how long ago, and I remember being there and meeting some younger artists, and they all assumed that these were computer paintings, and it sort of hadn't occurred to me. And then suddenly I thought, well, of course they look like maybe Al somehow fought his way into the future of all of this graphic design that was going on. But I agree with Judy that you have to be in front of those paintings. Then they don't look like a computer game. They look like these giant physical objects, and you're very aware of that power of the physical object.
Let me add that everything that computer animation can do, whether it's a still image or an actual animation, and a friend of mine used to be head of Cal Arts, and he said every few years they had to throw out all their computers and spend millions and millions of dollars buying new ones because when the software changed, they had to get more powerful computers. But everything that the computers do is the realization of an idea that human beings had. The computers don't come up with those ideas. Somebody has an idea and says, well, we could define a form this way. We could use this kind of math to define a form, or we can imagine a particular kind of space, or we can divide color space into X number of shades and Y number of tints and so forth. So it seems to me that Held's work prefigures or anticipates things that would develop in computer illustration, computer animation later, because he had those ideas. He had a brilliant way of pulling out the elements of painting, the elements of representation, and then making them abstract. I mean, we've been talking in different ways about, are the paintings, do they refer to the real world, or are they pure abstractions? But it seems to me, even though the end result is pure abstraction, that he's working with elements of representational systems with incredible acuity, this is something, the way a shape recedes in space, the way lines converge or diverge, the way lighting works. The implied analysis of all those things is extraordinary. And that kind of thinking is what, at a less beautiful level, the people who write the software are doing 10, 20 years later.
That's really well said. Beautiful.
Yeah, really great question.
Yeah, it sounds like we have one more question left then.
Yes. Thank you, Nicola, for that wonderful question. Our final question today will be from Fong. Fong, over to you.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was amazing, Pepe, Chris, Anna, and of course, Judy. What a wonderful way to begin our NSE in the 5th year. This is beautiful, really. I had 2 questions. Thinking about Al, one of the artists foundation who stepped forward to support the rail, because we have a amazing argument, just as Judy articulated earlier. He liked to fight. He loved to argue. And exactly what happened, I think it was in the fall of 2002, Alana Heights did that great show of Al at PS1. This is way before PS1 joined MoMA. And our former and first art editor, Daniel Baer, wrote a very critical review, a brilliant review, and associating Al with Hudson River School painter, would you believe it? Frederick Chuck was mentioned, Thomas Cole was mentioned about the American Sublime. Nothing to do with German idealism or the French Romantic movement. And we were hearing him earful because he was at the Andrew Forge, the former dean of Yale, who passed away that very fall, same thing. I attended the memorial at Yale, and he came up to me, nose to nose. He's he's a big man. I'm a tiny human being. And swear to God, he's about to beat me up. And, I grew up in the war in Vietnam. I know how to defend myself. but it was very aggressive. He was so angry that that reference was made. However, beautifully articulated by Daniel Baer, who's a very brilliant human being who studied with Richard Volheim at Berkeley University in philosophy and aesthetic. He knew what he was talking about, but I refuse to believe that analysis. And basically say, how dare you compare me with the American Hudson River School painting? I say, well, first of all, I didn't write the article, sir. I didn't write it. I just published it. Secondly, how would you repudiate? How would you offer a contrary view to that of Daniel Baer? He said, it's very simple. I live in Italy. I live in Todi, beautiful city, Umbria. I've been studying Piero da Francesca forever. You know that painting? He looked at me and talked loudly. I was so embarrassed, really. It was a memorial, you all, but he was speaking with loud voice, Pepe. And he say, have you ever visited Piero Flagellation of Christ in Urbino? He say, I think I have been there twice, so I made the reference, including the flagellation by, I think you know this beautiful book, Pepe, you all probably know, the Enigma Piero, or Piero Carlo Ginsberg. I read it in my last year in college, in 1985. And I'm so happy I read that, because I can certainly understand the frustration that he's trying to inject. You know, this is I don't know whether this reading have any reasonable rapport insofar of the early reference someone asked about, you know, science technology. It's very important to notice that this is emphatically true, Chris, and you and I, who went to the Lee Bonteque show at MoMA PS1. We went twice. Lee Bonteque, one show, and the other was Litharov. And it's very important that reference being made, because I remember when I only met Catherine Bigelow, only once, who of course was married to the great director who made Alien, remember? Ridley Scott. And you have to remember that Catherine Bigelow was a great friend of the artist. She went to art school. She was a student of the late poet Bill Buxton, who introduced her to all kinds of art. She went to the Whitney Independent Study. She even had a small role in Richard Serra's small film. It's called Prisoner Dilemma. See, she knew everybody. You can imagine she must have introduced Ridley Scott to Lee Bonteque's painting. So it does have an effect in the creation of Alien. I'm sure similar thing can be said about Al's painting. People can misread it in different way. I'll have nothing to do with it. So sorry, I'm talking way too long. Where is my question? My question is this. If you think of Piero, the flagellation of Christ, we have seen it in art history class. You remember how monumental it was? It appeared on screen. You have the two space divided in the middle, Albertian kind of space, but nevertheless, he manipulated for his own so-called potential two-point perspective. We've seen that certainly appear in Uccello as much as Piero. Not so much in Andre Mantegna and whoever else was deploying perspective at the time. This is early. So my point is that I'll argue his argument was simply, it might be as large as my painting appear. The ultimate desire is to capture the sense of intimacy, like the way Pollock had to use that kind of large proportion in order to capture the vast intimacy, which you can argue easily exists in Albert Pinkham Ryder. When Pollock was asked only one interview among the American master who you most admire, his response was Albert Pinkham Ryder. So our Bingham Rider, if you go to the mat now, it's 13 inches by 13 inches. I believe flagellation of Christ is no more than 23 inches by 32 inches. It's so small. So what is the point? The point is that if you go back and start rereading Clement Greenberg, the American type painting, he argued for the American chiaroscuro. Remember that? The American chiaroscuro, which is different than that of the European. There's no glazing. So that's what I was trying to get at. A sense of intimacy despite of the large scale, the large proportion. So can you, particularly, you all knew so well with our thinking, Victoria thinking about that sensibility. So I'm asking particularly Judy and Chris, who studied with Al, and then also maybe Pepe, because he's so brilliant as a historian, and so is Anna in her own work as a painter. That's the question. Despite of the fact of the large scale, can there be a sense of intimacy in our work, which he desired very much so? Start with you, Judy.
Oh gosh. When Anna sort of talked about movies, I remember Al and I always used to go to the movies. And there was a moment when I was talking about Technicolor and, these kind of CinemaScope, and he loved that scale. But when you sit in a movie, you go in and out, right? You focus here, there, watch what's going on in the background. I think there is, I don't know, when I was talking about like his mom and dad dying, those paintings, there was this infinite light and this like endless, like kind of like a going off into the hinterland. So there was an intimacy in the content, but I think, if you're standing in front of them, you're stuck with being brought into them. So in that way, yes, but I don't know if he would have thought like that. I think that these works came out of a really deep place, and I don't think he had the words for it.
Right. Beautiful.
Well, I think one thing that might touch on intimacy in the gigantic paintings is that the inner scale in the paintings is vast, so that you can maybe make out a giant, like in Black Nile #7, for instance, there are these gigantic forms. And at the same time, there are things that are as big as your thumbnail that are very carefully and deliberately placed. So when you come up to the paintings, there's the sense of, oh, here's a tiny thing. Here's a vast thing. And so the inner scale of the paintings does also always come back to a very small, very human moment. Even though the larger image is vast, there's also an attention to a tiny scale, which is what kind of generates a sublime vision. But that the tiny little moments are very human. You go like, oh, it's almost funny. You go like, oh, there's a tiny little edge behind this form, and it's 2 inches. So I think that's a very intimate situation.
Thank you, Chris. Anna?
Well, you just taught me a whole lot I didn't know, and I didn't piece together. I think I've been talking about that this whole time. There is a possibility for intimacy to be born out of spectacle. I think that the visceral response I have to his work, when I look at Roberta's Trip, my first thought of that was the afterlife. And it seems like almost like this vascular configuration and this sort of bowed horizon. It arrested me visually, optically, through the color, sort of my first order of perception. And then I started to name and associate the other elements to my own body. So in that way, it's very macro, micro all the time when I think about Al Held.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, let me chip in here, and I'm actually kind of resisting the idea of intimacy. I mean, I think that, what Chris has mentioned a couple of times about scale is tremendously important. And actually, while we're discussing this, Eleanor, could we bring back that detail from Roberta's trip? Because there's a fantastic sense of scale. I mean, you pointed out, Chris, in regard, sorry, if we go to the next one where it's the detail that gives us a closer view.
Also, Roberta was his sister
Yeah.
very much.
Yes, thank you. Oh, Roberta was his sister. No, I didn't realize that. So, as Chris, like you were saying about Black Nile, they're, tiny little things that are so carefully done. And, so you go from these small relationships to enormous ones, an enormous space. So it produces an incredible sense of engagement, but I'm not sure that's the same as intimacy. Fong, this is where I'm pushing back against what you were saying.
Yeah.
It has the engagement, but I don't feel it's intimate. I don't feel I'm close up to anything in particular. And I would say I've much the same response to the Piero, and I'm trying desperately to remember if I've ever seen it firsthand or just showed it in a lot of survey courses. But it's always struck me in the Piero how the figure of Christ and the flagellation is taking place deep in space. It's not on top of us. It's not like a Bellini or something. Bellini or Botticelli would have pushed that way into the foreground.
Yeah.
But Piero pushes it way back, so you have to strain to see it, which makes you very engaged with it.
Yes. Well, I mean, remember, Pepe, it was not my view, it was his view.
Right.
I'm
Okay.
just
Well,
giving what he desired to be thought of, to be respond to. It's interesting because thinking about what Judy was saying earlier about the massive sending, erasing, trying to eliminate painted gestures so this doesn't accumulate, just as you describe about Mondrian, rectilinear, vertical, horizontal can be moved, sometimes not just half an inch, sometimes can be 1/18 of an inch. But you see the accumulation, the palimpsest in the paint, for those of us who do paint, can be sensitive to that minute changes or revision. The fact that he painted so thickly for so long, Chris, Judy and Anna, and then some point he flipped to the opposite, which I can't help but the other, I must confess, and I shut up essentially here because I have so much thing to think about Al right now, is that he was once, as youth, a member of the Communist Party. And then when whatever happened in the 50s, he changed because I know he did mention about how he voted for Reagan, because that's when my family came to America, 1980. And you remember it was, I don't know, it may be the same time when Michael Harrington created the Democratic Socialists of America with Irvin Howe, combining the old left and the new left with the new focus, emphasis on what the Student for Democratic Society did to advocate for participatory democracy in 1973. You remember all that. So I wonder, the political switch have anything to do with what we've been talking about. And it's not a judgment, by the way. This is to say you can be a left-wing human being and paint right-wing pictures, and you can be a right-wing person and paint left-wing picture. We talk about Manet and Cézanne and Renoir and other people to Degas for sure. So I'm not making a judgment. I'm just wondering the political thinking and the pictorial invention of our complexity. Anybody can take the question. I would love to hear it.
But one thing that happened in the 50s was that Stalin died, and then Khrushchev denounced him at what was supposed to be a secret speech to the heads of the government, but it leaked out, and Khrushchev denounced all the monstrous things that Stalin had done. And I think that really shook a lot of people. And then, of course, there was the suppression of the Hungarian rebellion, so that I think a lot of people who'd been drawn to communism because of its utopian ideals, found themselves repelled by the reality of it.
Yeah. Well, that's answer everything. Thank you.
Right. But I
City
was
on the
thinking
hill.
about
Yeah, the seed
what you said a moment ago about, it wasn't your point about intimacy, it was Al Hell's. And now I'm feeling tremendously envious of Judy and Chris, who got to have these arguments with him. And I think, can we bring him back from the afterlife so we can argue about this?
Oh, man.
Well, thank you, you all. But I agree with Chris, Judy, and all of you. Really, I'll need to deserve a retrospective, either at the Whitney or MoMA, and it should travel all the way to China. I think that's important to keep that in mind. So here we are, sending our most, basically admiration. This is a first homage, number one, really, to the great Al Hell. To acknowledge, because of that argument, he must have left some encouraging desire to the foundation was created. Therefore, Mara had reached out his beloved daughter, terrific artist, to underwrite the Al Hell critical essay in the rail. Amazing. So I'm truly always grateful to Al from here to eternity. So thank you. Back to you. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Fong, for those really wonderful questions. And a huge thanks again to Pepe and Anna and Chris and Judy for this beautiful, beautiful conversation. To conclude this afternoon's NSE, we're going to hear a reading, which Pepe will tell us a little bit more about.
Well, this is actually a poem that Anna suggested, which I didn't know before, by W.S. Graham, appropriately called The Constructed Space. And Anna is too modest to read it herself, which is too bad, because I would love to hear you do so, but I will try to convey something of it. So here we go. The Constructed Space. Meanwhile, surely there must be something to say, maybe not suitable, but at least happy. In a sense, here between us two, whoever we are. Anyhow, here we are, and never before have we two faced each other who face each other now across this abstract scene stretching between us. This is a public place, achieved against subjective odds, and then mainly an obstacle to what I mean. It is like that, remember? It is like that, very often at the beginning, till we are met by some intention risen up out of nothing. And even then, we know what we are saying, only when it is said and fixed and dead. Or maybe, surely, of course, we never know what we have said, what lonely readings are read into the space we make. And yet I say, this silence here, for in it I might hear you. I say this silence, or better, construct this space so that somehow something may move across the caught habits of language to you and me. From where we are, it is not us we see, and times are hastening, yet disguise is mortal. The times continually disclose our home. Here in the present tense, disguise is mortal. The trying times are hastening, yet here I am, more truly now this abstract act become. Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pepe, for that wonderful reading. Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, for sharing that poem with us. It's been, again, such a treat to hear this dialogue today and start off our NSE fall season. We'd also like to thank Daniel and Lily at the Al Held Foundation and also to the team at Third Eye for supporting us in our preparations ahead of today's event. Thank you as well to the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSC program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can explore on our YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work via the link in the chat. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for Can't Change the Past, Michael Brown Jr., 10 Years Gone, a conversation and reading with Quincy Troop, Alexis Riviere, Nicole Seeley, and Alma Birch. Thank you so much to you all for tuning into the NSE, and you can now turn on your
Eleanor, I'm sorry, because it's being recorded and this is sort of
Sure.
a momentous occasion of the new social environment season. I would also like to thank Fong. I think we all would. This is an incredible resource, the new social environment archive, and now the new season. And it brings to mind a quote that I carry crumpled up in my wallet. And it says, to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of art. And that's a Henry David Thoreau quote. And I think that Fong is a living example of that this new social environment that started out in the pandemic has become a work of art by all of you and directed by Fong. And it's so generous, it's almost unbelievable. So I just want to go on record in recorded land to say that. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was so lovely. Yeah, I'll turn on everyone's microphones to say hello and goodbye. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Anna, thank you all so
Pepe.
much.
Thank you all so
Judy.
much.
Thank
Great
you.
conversation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye, Chris. Bye,
Bye.
Judy.
Judy.
Bye, Cal.
Bye.